Hey everyone, it's MK. Welcome back to MK Quilts and MK Quilts University. So today behind me is a beautiful quilt that we're going to use as a backdrop for this new content surrounding vertical border chunking. Now, I have other chunking content here on the university site, but I really wanted to redo it because the old stuff is just that. It's kind of dated. I've got a new quilt project, and this new quilt project is perfect to start with vertical chunking using piano keys. Piano key borders are some of my absolute favorite borders to work with, and this quilt fits the bill for a couple of reasons. Let's take a look at her. So the first thing is, of course, it's a beautiful trip around the world styled quilt, and this entire quilt is the backdrop for another course here on MK Quilts University. It's a sew along with me, but that's not what we're focusing on today. But I will drop information here in the course about this quilt and the pattern. What we're really focusing on today is this beautiful outer border. Now the border is a printed fabric, and that's where I really want to start in explaining my thought process for quilting out this border. Many times when you have a border that has a heavily printed fabric, we kind of intuitively know that anything that we quilt on there, one, probably not really going to show, and two, we probably really don't want it to show all that much because the print fabric is so beautiful. But it does need to be quilted. Whenever that scenario presents itself, I typically go for piano keys. I have a lot of piano keys that I have collected over the years. We'll look at some of those when we go into simulation. But basically on this quilt, I want to keep the quilting in the border simple. Now, I am using a solid black Bella for my backing, which means that all of the quilting that I have planned is really going to show on the back. But in the border, we want to keep it more simple. Now, for those of you who may not even know what I'm even talking about when it comes to vertical chunking, all I mean is that when we load this quilt onto the quilting frame, the outer left and right border are going to be vertically loaded on my quilting frame. Basically, that means that whatever distance is between my bars, that's all that fits, and that's all that I'm going to be able to quilt. Now, some people don't really favor chunking. They would rather maybe just leave those outer left and right borders empty and then turn the quilt, put the quilt back on the frame so that you can have your left and right borders become your top and bottom borders, and then once again you have horizontal borders to work with. Okay, that's simple, and it's not that that's wrong. It's just, for me, whenever possible, I want to load the quilt once and do all of the quilting from top to bottom and be done. All right, so that's where vertical chunking comes in. Now, if you just think of the word chunking, that really describes what we're going to be doing. We're going to be building a border, and I'm going to do that in simulation. I'll show you my thought process and how I build that ahead of time. But when we get to the quilting machine, we're going to have to break it down into manageable chunks that fit in our throat depth. Now, the thing about chunking that really makes it one of those techniques that you have to perfect is that where one chunk stops, the next one needs to start. And that connection point needs to be seamless. You want whoever is looking at that quilt to think that you stitched it along horizontally, when really you've stitched chunks vertically and you've connected them. So that connection point, very important with chunking. The thing about this quilt and piano keys is it is an outer border. Piano keys are typically just straight line forms of quilting designs, which means that those lines can extend all the way past the border, which means we'll be in our batting, which means those connection points, although we want to try to get them really, really closely matched up, They don't have to be perfect. And this is why I love starting with piano keys when I'm teaching chunking, because we can learn the technique, but the match point can be in the batting, which means that eventually that's going to get trimmed off, the binding's going to come over, and if you didn't make that match point be perfect, it's going to be okay. All right, so the very first thing that I always do on any quilt is I take my handy dandy tape measure and I go ahead and I get a lot of my dimensions. Now again, on this quilt, I am planning other spectacular quilting for the inside. I'm not covering that in this course, but I would be taking measurements like block measurements, sashing measurements, and of course, my overall dimensions and my outer border dimensions. So I'm going to get that accomplished. I'm going to write down all of that information, and then I'm going to meet you inside of Pro Stitcher Simulation so that we can do the planning of our border. And then it's off to McFinity. We'll get her loaded and we'll start stitching. Top border, it's going to be a piano key, but that's going to be simple. It's when we start the vertical chunking that I want to bring you along and show you exactly how that's done at the machine. All right, give me a few minutes. Let's meet in simulation.
All right, now to the meat of the matter. I want to start by telling you that how I have come into my current realm of chunking really has been a growing and learning process for myself. Very much in the olden days, should we call it, I did a lot of thinking and manually calculating the size that my chunks needed to be. I did a lot of pre-planning of my chunks and sizing them to certain sizes that I would later stitch out. Now, in some circumstances, I still do pre-planning of my chunks where I'm going to build a border, but then I'm going to chunk it down before I even step up to the machine. Mostly what I'm doing now is something that I call chunking on the fly. And all that means is I'm going to use simulation to set up my border because I have my dimensions, I have my line drawing, I have my area box. All of that is going to help me build the true size and dimension of my border. Later, when I get to the quilt, when I'm truly standing there, I can see how much of that border fits in where I'm currently at my quilt, how far have I advanced, how big of a space do I have in between the bars, all of those things. And I will determine the size of the chunk later when I'm really looking down at what I have. Okay, so I call that chunking on the fly, where I build it and then I decide later on the fly as I'm quilting where I'm going to chunk it. And that is a perfect segue into what I want to show you with chunking of piano keys, because there's really no need to pre-plan how big of a chunk and then save that chunk, because it's going to be different most likely each time you advance, and they're just straight lines. So it's going to be very easy to do that on the fly. All right, well, first things first, let's build. I always like to show you the way that I really do things, and I would normally start with MKDI to pick my design. I already have MKDI open in the background, and I had already done a search, but let me just show you how that's done. Go up under your pattern folders, come up to the top line, and I'm just going to type in piano. Okay, now obviously this is not an MKDI tutorial, but I have gone through every piano key that I own, and I have put the keyword piano on that. Okay. And obviously, in many of the piano key designs, the word piano is in the title. But having it as a keyword really is the safest way to be able to find all of your piano key designs. Now, for the purposes of this quilt and to teach, I really wanted to start with a very, very simple piano key. So down here on the list, traditional piano keys. It is a free offering with Pro Stitcher. That's another reason I wanted to choose it. So this is the design that we're going to use. In MKDI, if I click on it and I decide that's the one I want, I usually just throw it right into my folder. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to say copy file to. I'm going to point myself at my working subfolder, look for my Madison 6 chunking class. All right, and I did see that that misspelling is still there. We'll fix that later. Okay, so I had just right-clicked, copy to folder, and hit save. Now, the next thing that you can do is just right-click and say Open in Pro Stitcher Premium. Now, you might be thinking, MK, why don't you just open it in Pro Stitcher Premium and then save it into the folder? Well, yes, I could do that, but sometimes I forget. And here's the thing. As I'm building any of my layouts for this quilt or any other quilt, I like to have one instance of a design that I'm using in its raw format, right? Its original format in the folder that I'm working with. Okay. So that if something happens, I have to rebuild something or whatnot, I at least have the original design in the folder. Well, if I do file open and I open it right into Pro Stitcher, I usually get so excited and then I start building. And then later on, I realize that I didn't put that design in my folder. Now, can I go at that time and find it and go find it and put it in the folder? Well, yes. Does that waste time? Yes. Okay, so I'm trying to give you sometimes do what I say, not what I do. So, first of all, from MKDI, copy it into your folder and then open it in Pro Stitcher. Okay, now clearly, you guys, here's the third way to do it. I'm just going to close this. Let's just pretend that you went to MKDI, you found it, you did copy to folder, you put it in the folder. Fine. Then you came over here to Pro Stitcher. You can just do File, Design, Open, point yourself at your folder, and there it is. Okay? Always more than one way to do something.